The milk's looking a little green. Hope it's not bad. Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there. You know, being an invisible camera and all in a 3D environment. Today we're gonna figure out why it is when I search up satisfying videos, not one features babies being drop-kicked. I think I read that wrong.
I wanna take a pic with Cardi B inside my cardigan.
I tend to see many critics of Eva act as though the reason they don't like the franchise is due to the inherent flaws of the writing. And while Eva has its flaws, they are minuscule and barely noticeable unless you are looking for them. Or, like me, have seen the series multiple times. And the times that they can utter a common technique of story theory, it's always a complete misuse, either by ignorance or purposeful misguidance. It's almost like novice critics misusing story terminology and being ill-informed on why and how these techniques should be used is a breeding ground for unhelpful criticism and critique. This is why in this video I'm going to be tackling the most significant negative reviews of Neon Genesis Evangelion.
Defense!
This is the area where NGE failed as an anime. Prior to making NGE, Hideaki Anno had suffered from depression for a while, and the characters in NGE were created in such a manner as to reflect his struggle against mental illness. Each of the characters is flawed in different ways, something that was unusual in anime at the time. Given Anno's talent as a director, this should have led to some interesting and highly original character development. Unfortunately, the show failed in this area because of one key factor: Ikari Shinji. For many people like myself, the main issue we have with the show isn't the story, or the animation, or the sound, it's the characters, and in particular, Ikari Shinji. In creating him, Anno and the rest of the production team lost focus on the other characters. Shinji is not your typical hero in that he isn't courageous, or handsome, or intelligent. In fact, Shinji considers himself to be worthless. The issue I have is that the show focuses far too much on Shinji, almost to the extent where the other characters were simply plot devices for his development, and not enough on the characters around him.
He's the protagonist. Of course he's gonna have most of the focus of the story and development. Rather, there'd be a problem with the story if he didn't. Every A-cast character has their own desires, needs, motivations, and arcs. Yet, you say they almost work as plot devices for Shinji's development. I mean, even most of B-cast have their own arcs. C-cast has their fair share of character building for being C-cast. Even if that was the case, that's a far better way of implementing plot device characters than other anime, or even future renditions of Eva, as most use plot device characters as nothing more than objects to progress the story in unnatural ways, or merely exposition, especially since A-cast should bring dimension to the protagonist. While I disagree with McKee's definition of dimension as contradiction, I would call it breaking persona based on his explanation. I would say he hit the nail on the head when it comes to how these contradictions surface, which is through other characters. After all, it's only natural to let your persona slip when you feel safe being vulnerable around specific people. In classics of writing, you can find the author adding A-cast characters to add dimension to the protagonist. While in more modern writings, the addition of A-cast characters in anime feel more like just wacky personalities, simply added as a way to keep these long-ass epics from feeling stale. In any case, the A-cast and the B-cast are not plot devices for Shinji's development. I mean, the easiest example of adding dimension to A-cast characters to point out is episode 7, where Toji and Kensuke point out to Shinji that Misato feels comfortable enough to break persona around him. And this is a filler episode, mind you. If only other anime could write filler episodes as good as Eva, I wouldn't mind them so much. I thought to myself when writing this script, realizing that I skip episode 7 on every rewatch of Eva. This is not a one-off thing, by the way. There are plenty of other examples of Anno building characters in goals, motives, backstories, arcs, flaws, the whole 9 yards.
That's not to say Shinji is a bad character, he's not. The problem is that one can only stomach so much unjustified self-pity, which unfortunately most of it was in his case, before wanting to slap some sense into the person in question. It's been pointed out to me that Shinji wanted to kill himself because he thought he was worthless, and that he should be pitied because of the bad hand he was dealt. I'm sorry, but that argument doesn't wash with me. If someone truly wants to kill themselves, then they will, so Shinji didn't really want to die. In addition to that, I know quite a few people who have been dealt the worst hands possible, yet they do not whine and complain about it, and many of these people did consider themselves to be useless/worthless at one time or another, yet they suffered in silence for the most part. What Shinji wanted was for people to pity him and tell him he wasn't worthless, and while this is not necessarily a bad thing, it was overused in NGE to the point where I wanted to put him out of his misery, and not because I pitied him.
I'm going to destroy this damn pussy.
The fact that Shinji's character has a tendency to ram his sense of worthlessness into the faces of the other characters is what put me off, as that type of behavior is usually for attention rather than a cry for help, and because of the show's focus on Shinji, you can imagine how much I wanted to hit him afterwards. It wasn't that I didn't understand, it was just that they failed to depict him as an object of pity, and instead he came across as a whining, self-pitying, attention-seeking, and generally loathsome person.
Ah yes, here's where you've shown your cards. Yeah, Shinji's not a bad character, but the aspects of Shinji pursuing the things that he wants too much, the part that makes him an active character, is the aspect that makes him cringe. At least in your eyes. This is odd because the way I see it, Shinji doesn't often seek much sympathy from other characters that much. Well, at least not in the way that you mean. He does try to be liked by the other characters, but not by complaining but piloting the Eva. Most of the time, he is in fact pretty kept to himself. So it makes me wonder how exactly you came to this conclusion.
As for the other characters, in particular Rai and Asuka, they did get a certain amount of development throughout the series. Unfortunately though, their characters, as well as the rest of the cast, were overshadowed by the mammoth amount of development given to Shinji.
When I first read that, I wondered how on earth someone could possibly think that Shinji has so much development that it completely overshadows Asuka's. And then I realized something. It sounds like he's talking about 25 and 26 rather than the whole series, because up until those two episodes, the so-called development was pretty spread evenly throughout the characters. It's only when the last two episodes that what you said actually holds some truth. But it's only 2 episodes in a 26 episode series. It's like nothing, especially when you consider that there's a far better official ending out there. And while in the movie he does hold most of the development, he is, after all, the protagonist, so it's not like that's a problem. And yeah, he does plead for some sympathy from Masato, but that's for like less than 10 minutes, and most of it happens off screen. So, what's your issue with the characters again?
I actually quite enjoyed the concept behind NGE, as it made a nice change of pace. I did, however, have some issues with the convenient Deus Ex Machina of Unit 01, as well as a number of other coincidences that were scattered throughout the series.
No. Was a response I got as an argument against the idea that the orbiting camera shots in 3.0 are nauseating, which is funny because he called my arguments a few sentences prior obtuse and lacking critical thinking, as if an argument of the word no contains critical thinking. I swear, someone has to tell LOGH fans that speaking with an above average vocabulary won't make up for their below average intelligence. What the hell are you staring at? My point being, unlike this dumbass, I'd like to explain why Berserker mode isn't actually a Deus Ex Machina, which is a little difficult considering that even the Deus Ex Machina's biggest hater, Bob McCree, gives an unhelpful description of what this cringe cliche is. And when you remove the unnecessary fluff, His definition boils down to coincidence ending. But like me, most people probably wouldn't agree with this definition. This is what I found in my few minutes of googling Deus Ex Machina. According to Wikipedia, it is a plot device whereby a seemingly unsolvable problem in a story is suddenly and abruptly resolved by an unexpected and unlikely occurrence. Merriam-Webster says a person or a thing that appears or is introduced suddenly and unexpectedly and provides a contrived solution to an apparently insolvable difficulty. And the third website I visited was Britannica, which was basically a copy and pasted version from Merriam-Webster. Since they are all quite similar, I'm just gonna use the Merriam-Webster version. After all, contrived is a synonym of unlikely, so this definition shouldn't cause for much fuss. So for Berserker to be considered a Deus Ex Machina, it must be suddenly introduced, or in other words, have no foreshadowing, while also being unexpected and be contrived. So, does Berserker have foreshadowing? Oh wow, as it turns out, it does. And since a Deus Ex Machina must fill out all criteria, that means that it's already not a Deus Ex Machina. But I'm not moving on yet, because I'm not satisfied with just showing how it doesn't meet only one criteria. So is it unexpected? Yeah, kinda. But at that point, any plot twist would be considered a Deus Ex Machina since they too are unexpected. So that leaves one left. Is it a contrivance? Well, suppose that you consider that Berserker mode is consistently activated in circumstances when the pilot is under extreme distress, and the fact that it has foreshadowing. In that case, it's obviously not. Dookie head.
The story itself isn't all that original, and it has clearly borrowed elements from other sci-fi stories. What made the story seem to be original was the inclusion of pseudo-religious and pseudo-philosophical concepts, as well as the inclusion of Freudian psychology. These formed core elements of the story, so what would have been a standard save the Earth scenario became a dive into the psyche of the characters. The basic plot is borrowed directly from Space Battleship Yamamoto, and the idea of young people protecting the Earth was used by Anno himself in Top 1 Array. Unfortunately, the story breaks down in several places. Anno tried to make a show that merged all perspectives into one single view, and while he managed to achieve this in some measure, he failed, because he focused too much on Shinji, to the extent that no other options were ever considered. Here's what I mean. Any RV is a quasi-militaristic outfit, and as such, would generally have backup options available to them. The convenient Deus Ex Machina I mentioned earlier effectively removes all chance for anyone else to come to the fore, except for Shinji. That is, if the viewer is to believe that an organization such as any RV was supposed to protect the Earth, then they would at the very least look for other options. Especially considering Shinji's character flaws. This would effectively mean that they would have at least some combat veterans or trained soldiers who could handle the EVA units. The use of teenagers as the leads in the show was simply so that it would appeal to the teenage audience.
Wait, you mean to tell me a scenario where there are massive aliens trying to take back the Earth and the only thing stopping them are massive, brightly saturated biomechs? Isn't it realistic enough for you? Really? Don't worry, I'm just busting your balls. I know what you're trying to say. I just think it's funny that you were complaining about Anno giving a reason why it's teens piloting robots, even though the mothers in the Eva serve more of a purpose than just to keep Nerd from finding replacements, as you spend most of your argument explaining what would happen if this wasn't the case.
You see guys, this is what would happen if this Deus Ex Machina didn't exist. I'm not actually going to attempt to make an argument for why its writing is flawed. I'm just going to call it a DEM so people perceive it to be one, even though it makes zero sense to call it such in this context.
You act as though they didn't try to replace Shinji every chance they got. Heck, they even tried going a step further from what you suggested and automate the Evas so they wouldn't need pilots.
They only did this to make an anime more appealing to teens.
Okay, and? You act as though making an anime that appeals to teens will automatically make the writing bad. Ah yes, it's literally impossible to empathize with a character that is out of your age bracket, right?
Another area where the story breaks down is in its use of religious symbology. Many fans believe that what is shown in NGE is taken directly from religious beliefs, in particular Kabbalism, Judaism, and Christianity. While the names used in the show may be true to those religions though, in many cases the manner in which the reference is used is actually based on Anno's own definition, rather than the religious viewpoint, something for which Anno has been heavily criticized. In truth, the religious symbology used in the show was only really used to give the series an edge over other giant robot anime, i.e. Macross, Gundam, etc., and all of the various interpretations since have been ascribed to it by the viewers rather than the creators, something which is very well documented.
This is true, kinda. When you factor in the meaning of the Sephiroth and the Tree of Life, their use in Eowyn instrumentality make a lot of sense.
One big plot hole that I noticed, and one that should have been obvious to most people as well, was Shinji's isolationist attitude and Gendo's reaction to it. It's obvious to any who've watched the series that Gendo feels little sympathy towards Shinji. However, due to that convenient plot device using Unit 01 I mentioned earlier, Gendo needs Shinji to pilot the EVA unit. So, what you effectively have is the leader of a militaristic organization who feels little for others, and a teenager with supposed mental instabilities. This being the case, why wasn't Gendo forcibly dosing Shinji with MEDS to make him more compliant? If your purpose is to protect the Earth and its people from attack by extremely powerful beings, and you're basically a selfish person with your own agenda, then conscience or paternal instincts don't come into it. You simply do what's necessary, no matter what anyone else says. It's interesting that the whole psychology angle is only really supposed to apply to Shinji, isn't it? Characters like Gendo have been toned down because their actions would have drawn too much attention to themselves. Another convenient plot device.
This is probably the strongest argument you have, and yet it can barely hold 10 pounds. As it turns out, only 1 of 3 people prescribed with antidepressants benefit from it, so it would hardly be considered contrived to make them fail to work on Shinji. I also find it funny that he refers to Yui as being a convenient plot device, again, even though she has her own ambitions to be the evidence that humanity ever existed.
But hey, she forces Shinji to be the sole pilot of Unit 1. That must mean she's a plot device.
Right? I also love how at the end he made the point that Gendo not getting his own psychological exploration is in itself a plot device, which is interesting to say the least. I try to respect people's opinions, but I do have a few exceptions. One of those being, if you think Elfenlied is better than Ava. Like, you put some dude living out his fetish in a fictional story over Neon Genesis Evangelion. Like, there's gotta be something wrong with you.
The story starts in a fairly disorienting manner and then moves quickly from there. After about 20 minutes of confusion, however, the anime soon finds its feet and I begin to be able to follow what was going on.
Oh yeah, it's really hard to follow Shinji jacking off. Typically I find that most completely comprehend the beginning of the movie but lose their way after. You must be a special case though.
At around 40 minutes in I was actually somewhat interested. And then, the anime falls apart under its own philosophical weight. Apparently, the creators of this anime thought that they could substitute all semblances of plot with random scenes that supposedly have symbolic meaning. A quote from Roger Ebert's movie glossary comes to mind: "If you have to ask what it symbolizes, it didn't."
I love how detractors of Ava love to exaggerate the supposed flaws they find within Ava. Like, oh wow, one cutaway scene of Shinji building a sand pyramid and breaking it down is a complete substitute for plot. It's also ridiculous to believe that this scene is devoid of meaning, as if you have to go through mental gymnastics to realize that this is supposed to symbolize Shinji's self-destructive behavior. You didn't ask what is it symbolizing because it didn't. You are doing it because you didn't care enough to think about it for 5 seconds. That, or you have a brain tumor, in which case, you should get that checked out. But having seen how long it's been since you've logged in, I suppose it's probably too late.
I have seen this movie several times, and still cannot enjoy the film one iota. I do not believe that it is because I didn't get the film. I believe that there is quite simply nothing to get. Certain Neon Genesis Evangelion fanboys have gotten a huge kick out of analyzing the show and attempting to fabricate some sort of interpretation of the events that transpire. But in my opinion this is a futile endeavor. The show's plot was deliberately made incomprehensible for incomprehensibility's sake. There is no meaning to the show other than to have no meaning whatsoever.
It's not that EOE is incomprehensible, more like it is both consistently fast-paced and accomplishes as much as possible within each scene. And since the movie basically never allows the viewer some time to process everything, not including the intermission because let's face it, most people skip that, it can cause plenty of confusion. I wouldn't consider this to be much of a flaw, as simply pausing when you feel confused or rewatching can yield far better comprehension, but once again, brain tumor. You don't have to be big brain to comprehend EOE, you just have to pay attention. I mean heck, even I was able to do it.
The difference between this film and other virtually indecipherable anime see, Cat Soup, Paprika is that End of Evangelion pretentiously demands interpretation. There is nothing to entertain the viewer beyond the movie's pompous symbolism, and this is the film's downfall.
Now I'm confused. How is it any different from the anime that you listed, as in the way that it pretentiously demands interpretation? Like, can you give an example? No? Okay.
Some may disagree, but I thought the original characters of Evangelion were excellent. All of them were almost perfectly imperfect.
Wow. Was that based?
And as a result managed to capture some of the darkest parts of the human soul. While none of the characters were particularly likable, every single one was captivating in their infinite flaws. These promising characters, however, are pretty much destroyed in the treadmill of an awful story. By the end of the show, just about every single individual has lost his or her humanity. Their actions no longer reflect any semblance of logic or compassion. Forget character development. This is an anime about action figures. Because of this, what was arguably Neon Genesis Evangelion's greatest strength becomes End of Evangelion's biggest fault.
I'm not gonna analyze every character for these, so for the first two, I'll use Shinji, and for the last one, I'll use Masato since the examples I can pull are discernible and easy to understand. At the beginning of the film, Shinji starts off depressed and lonely. He just killed the one thing that loved him, and he just got done jacking off to his high school bully. He's at the point where he doesn't care if his brains get blown out. Masato kisses him to raise his spirits and to give him a skewed version of what he's been chasing after this whole story. Love. He hears Asuka getting obliterated as he sits there, unable to pilot due to his Eva being covered in bakelite. Once he's finally let in, he gets put through instrumentality, where he experiences what it's like to become one with others. Since he never got a pure version of what he wanted, he forces everyone to join him, which ends up lining up with Seilei's plan. Can't really expect much else when you put a mentally unstable teen in the seat of God. After experiencing the infinite stream of consciousness and instrumentality, he realizes that the bliss he felt from it isn't real. Having come to the realization that the false happiness of instrumentality pales in comparison to the real deal. So, he decides that even though reality will allow others to hurt him again, reality still wins over instrumentality because, at the very least, the pain he feels after the dream will be real. The film ends on a shot with Shinji on the same beach where the movie started, no longer depressed and no longer alone. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a fair amount of development to me. And even though not every decision that he made was strictly logical, it made sense for him to do it at that moment. I mean, after all, the character's actions in the series weren't logical either, but they would make sense to anyone put in his shoes. I'm sure that's what Viva Fruit meant by it, but I thought it'd be good if I clarified. And for compassion, let's go back to that kissing scene. Sure, Masato acts pretty cold-hearted to Shinji for most of the reunion, but that's because she thinks that will get him to snap out of it. But once she realizes that it's not working, she tries giving him what he's been striving for this entire time. Even if it's a twisted version of it, it's all she has left. I don't know about you, but her attempting to get Shinji out of his depressive state sounds pretty compassionate to me. Sure, she didn't do it for the purest means, and she has a selfish ulterior motive of saving her own bacon and everyone else's, but guess what? That ulterior motive has been there from the start, and Shinji has tried to leverage it against her to get what he wanted. She would eventually forego it for a time, because of that, and because she missed him.
Scamboli reviews did a video called "You Don't Understand Ava."
Oh yeah,
right? In sarcastic text, you know, where he basically broke down why Ava is like basically a really badly told plot and really like like he basically broke it down in a way where I completely agreed with him.
That's what watching the show felt like, because they don't even attempt to explain any of the terms that, despite being essential to the plot, are barely mentioned. And when they are mentioned, it's only to say some vague shit like, yes, the Virginius theorem is nearing completion. What's a human instrumentality project? Well, I dug through the script, and between episodes 1 through 24, it's only mentioned 5 times, and we're told on episode 21 that it's meant to harness the power of a god, which doesn't even scratch the surface of what it actually does. How about the Lance of Laryngitis? It's mentioned once on episode 12, and you see Ray doing something with it. So you think, I wonder what that thing does. And it isn't talked about until episode 22. And for all that weight, this is what we learn. Seal wants it, Ikari wants it gone, it destroys AT fields, and it's hinted at sealing away Lilith. So they hype it up to be this crazy device that'll change everything, and we discover nothing about it. We discover nothing about it. Why does Dale want it? Where does it come from? You get interested in little concepts like the Instrumentality Project or the Angels just to get absolutely dirty necked by the writers, because these mysteries end up going nowhere.
Well, most of the terms used in the show are explained in EOE. You know, the intended ending of the series. Yeah, the lore is convoluted, but everything that needs explaining is either explained or demonstrated, so you know what's necessary. Or their terms are used in specific manners, so you can infer the basic purpose of it. Everything that is necessary and only that which is necessary is revealed in the series, and in the end of Evangelion. Oh, but you didn't watch EOE, even though you should have before this review. And the way you talk about the series, it would seem that you also need a rewatch of it. But I'll get into that when the time comes.
I'm obviously not a writer, but a good mystery creates questions that the audience wants answered and then answers them. It even makes you wonder, what's up with the angels? What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? So you keep watching. Maybe this is so popular because the reveal's really cool. And then the reveal never happens.
Yeah, that's cool and all, but Eva is not in the genre of mystery. Sure, it has elements of mystery, but it in itself is not a mystery. And while specifically the Dead Sea Scrolls don't get a big reveal, you can easily infer their purpose by how Sele talks about them, because guess what? That's all you need to know about them. In any case, a well-written story will only tell you the necessary information for the time being. This accomplishes 2 things. 1, it keeps the viewer invested enough to find out what the answer is at the end. And 2, verbal exposition is generally boring unless you have a way to spice it up like in The Wolf of Wall Street, or dramatize it like in Evangelion. And guess what? Evangelion withholds a lot of its lore until its intended ending, which is, once again, EOE. But I'll get more into that when the time comes. You see what I did there?
It really alienates the audience from the jump when you toss around all these terms and organizations without even bothering to explain them. Just watch the movies, Scam. I'll just watch the movies. I'd rather deep throat a tactical insertion than waste even another second researching the Eva lore.
Correction. Movie. You only need to watch one. End of Eva. It nullifies a lot of the points that you make against the series, and it's also a part of the Neon Genesis canon, so it's not an external resource like Eva Geeks. It is, after all, the intended ending of the series. You know, the ending where they didn't have time constraints because some terrorists thought it would be funny to toss nerve gas into Tokyo subways, forcing Ano to rewrite and his team to reanimate a lot of the scenes in the series, since the attacks were a little similar to an event in the anime. This was not a result of negligence. This was a result of Eva literally being too real. You're complaining about how much there was left unresolved before you watch the actual ending. I'm not here to say that Eva's lore isn't convoluted or that EOE resolves everything, but that it reveals and resolves everything that is important.
Every episode up until 14 follows the same exact formula. It starts off with either Shinji having daddy issues or the gang is going through some filler. Then midway through, an angel attacks, and usually it'll look like Team Shinji is winning. And suddenly, direct power to right thrust! Ma'am, the boosters have been disabled! You get a little montage of some League of Legends players spamming racial slurs in chat, and now they can't beat the angel. They spend 15 minutes planning how to kill it. You'll get some occasional dialogue like, don't fret, this is all foretold in the PP poo-poo complex. To make you feel like the plot is moving, and then wowie zowie, the new plan works perfectly the first time we tried it.
Yeah, that's great and all, but you missed the part where it doesn't. Episodes 1, 2, 3, and 4 don't follow that layout. 5 and 6 do, when you combine them. 7, as you said, doesn't really follow it. 8, 9, and 10 do follow it, but 11, 12, and 13 don't. And as you stated, 14 and beyond don't follow it either. So only 5 of the first 13 episodes follow the structure that you laid out, 2 of which you have to combine, and the new plan doesn't actually work out perfectly. 5 episodes out of 26 are predictable. It's enough to notice a pattern pattern, but it's not enough to really call the show predictable.
Asuka appearing, nothing important actually happens to permanently change the cast nor the world. No one dies, they don't uncover some major secret that causes a rift between characters, and it stays that way until the anime ends. If you want to use the "it's realistic" argument for the show, someone's gotta die when there's robots killing each other in the middle of the city, right? No. This guy's sister got pinned under some rubble. Whoa, how convenient.
Yeah, people do die when they fight, but the casualties get covered up. This was demonstrated in the first few episodes. Remember?
You know who else suffers from dementia?
Misato and Fuyutsuki survive a nuke on episode 18.
It's not a nuke, but sure. Unlike in the Ray test, where they were merely sitting behind protective glass, they are actually pretty far away from the launch site. Although they aren't far enough to go completely unharmed, they still imply that they're quite a distance away.
Episode 3, Deep and Throat are just fine sitting under a giant mech fight.
Duh. The Ava is barely moving since they're right there and the Angel isn't attacking them. You're either a complete dumbass, or you made this point in bad faith.
However, around episode 17, I actually started feeling nervous for a character. Something about having him pilot the Ava unnerved me, and by episode 18, his body is snapped in half against Shinji's will. It was a turning point for an even more serious point in the story. Unless...
Except he didn't actually snap him in half. They show him very much not being in two at the end of the episode.
The pilot's life signs are confirmed.
He's alive?
And it's not like it goes without impact either. Shinji never sees Toji again beyond the hospital. And not to mention that he was forced into paralyzing his friend, that was known for being quick on his feet in the most literal sense possible.
On episode 23, Ray dies a horrific and traumatic death. Nah, that's too crazy. Unless...
Resurrect is an interesting way of putting it, considering that she's a clone, which was something that was revealed a few episodes prior. Of course, she wasn't gonna die off completely. Well, except for the fact that the Rey that we knew for most of the series is gone. Most of her memories were basically wiped in the soul transfer. The intent of this event was not meant to be a tragic death, and more of a way of pushing Shinji away from Rey.
If a bully kicks the shit out of you every day, it doesn't matter if he had a rough upbringing or he's just young. The guy's still annoying. If someone gets on your nerves because he won't stop bothering you, it doesn't matter if he has some emotional issues because his parents divorced. He's still annoying, right? So why is it when it comes to anime, I'm all of a sudden supposed to forgive Shinji for being some easily manipulated whiny little Democrat because he's just 14 or it's realistic? Bottom line is, I don't like him. That's all that matters. Oh, I'm supposed to pretend like Asuka is the most insufferable red stain on the show because she's insecure? Because she has some issues? No. The author has a choice on whether or not to have these characters. Realistically, yeah, there's people like Shinji out there, but there's also people like Jack Lucas who made it through the most intense military training available at age 14. At 17, he stowed away on a ship headed for Iwo Jima on the front lines, and when he finally arrives, he has to storm the beach without a weapon. So obviously he grabs it off a dead soldier and charges right in. Upon joining up with a friendly team of soldiers, he starts getting shot at and boom! The first round of his rifle headshots a dude. His second round, however, jammed his rifle. He picked it up, although soaked in blood and sand. In the confusion, he realizes a live grenade's been thrown at his comrades and immediately hops on top and tells his homies to take cover. It's then that another grenade flashes past his face, so he grabs that one and throws it under his body, adding to the pile. The two grenades blow up and suddenly his guts are filled with metal. His comrades finish the battle and come back to collect his dog tags when they realize the fucker's still alive and still conscious. Guy makes a full recovery. Thank you. This has been Storytime with Scamboli.
You know what makes that story interesting in the first place is that it actually happened. Apply those traits to a fictional character with no discernible flaws and you get, let's face it, most teens are more like Shinji than they are like Jacqueline Lucas. He's one in a million. Built different, if you will. Most people would have a hard time empathizing with his character if he was in the world of Ava, because you'd either have to, 1, have a very similar experience in a war, or 2, be delusional. It's not that just some teens are like Shinji and the other are like Jacqueline, the majority clearly are. And guess what? If you don't like the characters, then that's on you. You see, it's not that people like these characters because of their personalities, they like them in spite of it. True character is not personality, but action. The same is true for flaws. Personality only gets you as far as to create sympathy from the audience, which is shallow. It only makes the characters likable. But giving a character a relatable flaw is what makes a character empathetic. And empathy, that cuts deep. If you give a character an empathetic flaw, then making that character sympathetic is purely optional. You have no point here and you have proven nothing. He later goes on in this section more about how the characters aren't likable and how Shinji has no character development. Wow, one Ava detractor says that Shinji has too much development and the other says that he has none. Wow. Ooh, a platform where most of the users have a basic understanding of story theory. Better say that Shinji has too much development. YouTube. Oh wow, a platform where most of the users have little to no understanding of story theory? Better say that he has no development, because I don't either. It's almost like they don't have a clue of what they're talking about. Yeah, I actually couldn't care less about Ava's symbolism, unless you were to symbolically say, put these balls in your mouth. And yeah, symbolism is basically DLC to a story. That is the strongest argument you have made in this entire video, and it's one that I'm sure most Ava fans, at least the ones that I talk to, already agree with. But there's one more part I'd like to talk about.
You learn in 7th grade what makes a story. The beginning, rising action, the climax, and falling action. Only there is no climax to Ava.
The climax stage in Freytag's pyramid is not the final showdown between the protagonist and the antagonistic forces. That is the crisis stage. The climax stage is old story theory speak for midpoint. You can see this by how it's described as being the turning point of the story. It would be utterly retarded to have the final showdown in the middle of the story, don't you think? The funny part is that Ava does have a climax in the original meaning of the stage, in episode 15. I go into more detail about this in my last video of Ava. My point is that Ava does have a climax, and it does have falling action. And Shinji does technically have a final showdown with all 3 levels of antagonism in the last 3 episodes. And there is sort of a denouement to his arc. It's not the best one when it comes to the original series, but it does have a denouement. Now, why did I bring this up in particular? To show that once again that these detractors of Ava don't know what they're talking about. That's not to say that they don't have a valid reason to not like the show. If they can't get past the characters' personalities, then you know what? That's understandable. But to blame it on the quality of the writing is ridiculous, especially since these detractors don't have a firm grasp on these concepts that they try to use against Ava. A common disregard of criticism that Ava fans love to use is, you don't understand Ava. It's funny because it's likely that they don't understand Ava either, nor is that the reason why they like it. You see, they don't like Ava because they understand it, they like Ava because Ava understands them. That's why you see such a strong connection with Ava and its fans. And since both Ava detractors and Ava fans have little to no understanding of story theory, the arguments they tend to get into go nowhere, pointing to aspects of the writing using what are essentially meaningless buzzwords like character development, despite not understanding what character development is, how and why it's used, or what makes it satisfying. In these particular cases of Ava detractors, it's all 3. I doubt they even realize that suggesting the focus on character development isn't a good idea, since character development is actually a symptom of a superior technique. Without the guidance of character arcs, the character development will likely be aimless and feel sloppy to the viewer, if they even recognize it. I could go on, but this video is long enough, and you get the idea. Anyways, I'm SteveDender, and my heart stopped!